Okay, hi everybody. Okay. So we're still in the middle of this sif about the necessity to pay for either a service or a rental when the period is completed. We saw the Imrei Yaakov. We were about to look at the Likutim. A chaf over belav, you violate a negative commandment for delaying payment. The Likutim says, Im meis hapoel, ein haben yoresh zuchus aviv le'inyan, sheyehi habalabayis over alav mishum baltolin. He says, if the worker passes away, then the son cannot demand timely payment in the same way that the father does. Agam de kaimelon, so that's point number one. Point number two, Agam de kaimelon de safek gezel ein sarach lahachzir, the gezel vaday omer rachmana. He says there is a halacha that if a person is not sure whether he's stolen or not, then there's no clear obligation for him to return something, because the Torah only prohibits certain theft, not doubtful theft. Mikol makom bischar sachir yesh omrim degam besafek chayev. Some say that if you're not sure whether you owe an employee money, some say that you have to pay it in order to fulfill your obligation. Kevin dahave asay de biyamot itein scharo, because the Torah does obligate you to pay him on the day when the payment is due. And so therefore it's like a safek de oraisa l'chumra, that it's a Torah doubt. You always have to be machmir when there's a Torah doubt. When it comes to Gezel, the Gemara makes an explicit drasha to exclude safek Gezel, but no such drasha was made to exclude a safek, a doubt as to whether you owe someone money for their services. The heicha da Torah kum asay tzarch sheyit kayem haasay bevadai. The im yesh bo safek avis sveiko lechumra v'tzarachiyim. He says, because of the fact that the Torah creates a positive obligation upon you, if you're not sure whether you fulfilled it or not, you have to go the extra mile and pay, even if you're not 100% sure. And the in the let's see. Okay, he has an interesting point in the footnote. He says this is from the Sefer Erech Shai. Udvarav miusadim al divrei hachavos das beveis hasafek. There's a very interesting discussion that we all studied. Many of us studied when we studied for smicha many years ago. There's a section on the laws of safek that are discussed in Yoredeya Siman Kuf Yud. Shetire Shitas HaRambam the Safek de Oraisa min HaTorah Lekula. He says the Rambam says an interesting point. He says we know that Safek de Oraisa lechumra, that when you have a doubt as to regarding a biblical law, you have to be machmir. However, is that a rabbinic law that you have to be machmir, or is it a biblical law that you have to be machmir? So the Rambam, this is a much more lengthy discussion. The Rambam is of the opinion that it's only rabbinic that you have to be machmir when you have a suffix on biblical law. But biblically, if there's a suffix de oraisa, you're allowed to be lenient. The Harashba hikshalav mikama mekamos, and the Rashba challenges the Rambam in a number of questions. The Alzeh tirates hachavosas sham shiny ben hecha de kosav rachmana kum va'asei uvein im kosav lo sasei. And the Chavosdas's explanation is that it depends on whether the Torah said it in a positive way or in a negative way, the commandment. Kagon b'chol halav dekosav rachmana ezel lo tochlu kagon chazir v'chalav v'chelav. Let's say the Torah says, do not eat pig, do not eat forbidden fat. So amrinan chazir vadai v'chela vadai lo sochal aval safek rashai le'echol. So there, biblically, what according to the Rambam, what that would mean is that if you're not sure if it's forbidden fat, biblically you'd be allowed to eat it, and only rabbinically does it become forbidden to you. Masha'en kein b'makom shemazhir kra b'kum va'aseh kagon b'sula me'amav yikach isha v'chein lekichas esrog va'achilas matzah. Let's say the Torah commands a Kohen Gadol may only marry a virgin, or the Torah commands you to take the esrog on the first day of Sukkah, so the Torah commands you to eat matzah on the night of Pesach. Bazeh amrinan de mechuyav sheyeh bevadai besula uvadai esrog umatzah below safek ayin sham. So you're obligated to make sure that there's not even a doubt as to whether you fulfilled the mitzvah or not. So the point being that because there's a positive commandment that you must make sure that you pay the worker at the end of his time period, even if you're not sure, you have an obligation to fulfill that. Okay, sorry, that's an interesting point. Just store it in your memory banks. May come in handy one day. So we finished the Imrei Yaakov, and what we were going to work on is the Biurim now. We talked about the importance of paying rent on time, even though you may not be in violation of Baal Tolin. He says, nonetheless, there is an opinion that says that since a house is considered to be non-real estate because it's attached to the ground, but it's not the ground itself, there is an opinion that a house or an apartment may fall under this category, misafek. So therefore, you have to make sure that you're careful about it. We'll just take a look at this biurim now. Adam shesachar dira mechaber letekufa meyusemes. Sorry, letekufa misuyemes. Adavar matzu yoter bedira limei hachopsha bekayetz. A person rents an apartment for a fixed amount of time. This is very common if, let's say, you're renting a summer cottage or some kind of Airbnb, so it's for a fixed amount of time. Uvetoch yemei haschirus azavis habayis misiba shel ones. And in the middle of the rental period, let's say you rented a cabin for 2 weeks, and for some reason you needed to leave the house only after 1 week. Kagon shenecha lahu o b'nei veso v'nelatz la'azov et hadira. So let's say someone got sick, sadly, and that necessitated them to leave their vacation. Are you obligated to pay the full amount? Or since you're leaving only after 1 week and not 2 weeks, can you just stop payment and only pay for the 1 week? Umatzino b'simin shin lamedalet if aleph depligi bazeh harishonim amordechai b'shem haram v'harashba. We see that there is a machlokus among the Rishonim, the medievalists, on this very point. So first we have on the one side, we have the Mordechai in the name of the Maharam and the Rashba, Meviim Ramah Sham B'zeh Lashon. And the Ramah cites them in the Shulchan Aruch as follows. Misha Sochar Bayis Ladurbo, if a person rents a house to live in, Umeis B'soch Zaman Haschirus, and he passes away within that period of rental, Ein Sarach L'Shalem Lo Rak Ma Shedorbo. You only have to pay for the time that you actually dwelled in that place. Mihu yesh cholkin, but there are those who disagree. Lachein im kibel haschar kulo ein sarach lahachzir klum kein nirali ad kan l'shana. However, because there are those who disagree and say that the landlord is entitled to full payment even if the trip was aborted, therefore, if the landlord already collected full rent, he's not obligated to give a refund. So according to the Rama's opinion, if you haven't paid the full rental yet, you're getting a cabin for 2 weeks, and you're making two payments of $1,000 each, and you had to, for whatever reason, some emergency occurred, some mishap occurred, you had to leave after 1 week, you don't have to pay for the second week. But if you already paid the $2,000 up front, because that was the condition of the deal, the landlord is not obligated to refund your money, because it's unclear as to whether there's a machlokes, says the Rama, as to whether a renter has to pay for the time that he didn't use the real estate. Now, that's the first opinion. Okay,
Rabbi,
opinion of the Rama. Yes.
okay,
Yes.
there's more opinions. I was just going to suggest that should
Okay.
it not make a difference if the landlord can rent out that second week?
Correct. Correct. Now, it's meant for renting out, but obviously sometimes it's very hard at the last minute to find someone to take it for just a week. Now, the das hashach sham ledina, the ikar hu kimaharam shapoter. The shach is of the opinion that you are the renter is patur from paying for the time that he didn't use. Mihu im kvar kibel haschirus ein sarach lahachzir mitam dekeven denasamos charo nisratzelo shia shalo afilu ye'ora onas. The shach says the same conclusion as the Rama, but for a different reason. He says if the renter already paid the landlord the full amount, the $2,000 up front, then the landlord is allowed to keep it, not because perhaps the law is different, but rather because the payment of everything up front is an indication that the renter was prepared to pay for the full 2 weeks, even if he had to abort his trip. That in itself is the indication. Why else would you pay up front? If that was the requirement of the landlord that you pay up front, that in itself is a tacit agreement that regardless of whether I end up using your cabin or not, that I am paying for the use of 2 weeks. And even if I have to leave in the middle, I'm not entitled to a refund. However, the shach then says that the landlord has to give him back something. Now, what is that something? He has to give him back what would a person pay to have an extra space to do with whatever he wants. In other words, that could be a small amount of money, but just the convenience of having an extra space where you can do your work, what would a person pay for that? Even if it's just to luxuriate. That's a very ambiguous amount, I agree. I'm not sure how you would evaluate that, especially if the cabin is somewhere far away from where you live. But nonetheless, the shach says you have to give back a partial refund, not a full refund. Uvemachane Ephraim isigal hashach v'nota beikar kaharashba ditzarech l'shalem kulo. And now we have a third opinion, which is the opinion of the Machane Ephraim, who says that you have to refund the entire amount of the rental that the guy ended up not using. And then we have other people who agree with that. And the Chazon Ish says that it's unclear what the halacha is. And therefore, if you've already paid the amount, the landlord would not be able to be sued to refund that amount because it's unclear how we paskin. Al kol panim lefi hachras harama deleel im lo kibel adayin scharo ein tzarech l'shalim lo. But it turns out that according to the Rama, if the renter has not yet paid the full amount and he has to abort the trip, then he doesn't have to pay the full amount. Amnam, but Shuvra isi b'shailos utshuvas tzemach tzedek ha'acharon simin memhei sheherich bazeh. I've noticed in the Sefer Tzemach Tzedek, there's two Tzemach Tzedeks, by the way. He says this is the latter Tzemach Tzedek, and he says that he goes through a very lengthy discussion of this. V'gam daito deha'ikar kuke harashba dechayiv litein lo scharo that, I'm sorry, the Rashba says that you have to pay, the renter has to pay the full amount. Vehevi b'shem maharam, daf pay simin shin peches, the mashma nomi dispir leika harash ba'ayin shamet zarachiyim. The kol zeh im ein hamasker maskiru la'acher. Now we get to Paul's issue. He says, according to, so we have one opinion that says you only have to make partial payment if you abort your trip. We have another opinion that says that you have to pay the full amount even if you end up not staying for whatever mishap. Now, but that's only if the landlord can't find another tenant for that second week. Aval imhu maskiru la'acher, vadai ein sarach l'shalim klum. But if the landlord can find another tenant, and therefore he's not losing any money by you vacating prematurely, then you don't have to pay. Now, this is true. Now, I guess obviously there might be some service charge to get the room ready for a new tenant. Got to get a house cleaner into the room. I wasn't planning to get a house cleaner until after 2 weeks. Now I've got to get her in after 1 week and clean the room a second time. So that you might have to, the landlord would be entitled to charge. But vafilu im kvar kibel hamos tzarich lahafzer. Accordingly, in that scenario where the landlord is able to find the second tenant, then even if the first tenant already paid for the 2 weeks, the landlord would have to give him back the money for the second week. That's really what halacha requires, since you found a different tenant. The kain cost of the pischei choshen, the kain hanidon hanal mari kishiyatza davka hasocher misham ba'oines. Okay, so it seems like a big issue will be, can the landlord find another tenant for that second week? If the landlord cannot find a tenant for that second week and he's already received the money, so then everyone or most opinions would hold that he's not obligated to return the money that he already collected for the second week. Why should he be out of pocket? Okay, why should he have to lose money because you decided that you had to leave? And maybe it was an onus, and we understand that, but that he should not have to assume the cost of whatever mishap happened to you. Okay, so that's point number one. But if he's able to find a tenant, then he's obligated to take the money for the tenancy and to return the money to you. And I guess he could, even though he doesn't say this, but I'm assuming you could subtract whatever cost it was to refresh the room with the housekeeper. Now, so the last point he makes is that this is all when the tenant had some kind of emergency which required him to cut short his trip. But if there was no emergency, but rather he just decided that he didn't want to stay longer, he had enough, he got bored, he wasn't happy with the view, or whatever it was, so then everyone would agree that he's obligated to pay the full rental amount, even if he decides to leave. The only question that the poskim discusses, the fact now that the unit is vacant may provide some benefit to the landlord. In other words, previously, this cabin was occupied. So it may have created some inconvenience because the rest of the land now was, let's say, there was a lakefront cottage, and therefore the landlord has no access to the lake because the cottage is rented out. But now that the place is vacant, the landlord has the ability to go on his boat that he had previously committed to the tenant. So is the landlord now obligated to refund some of the money based on the benefit that he now is able to get from the vacant property. The Hanasivos Hamishpat Svirale Shemenakalo Mehaschirus Kama Adam Hayamuchan Lahaskir Diraso Bepachos Mehamachir Betanai Shalo Yadurabo Klal Dumya Depoil Batal. The Nasivos, there's one commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says that you do have to give him a discount based on what would a landlord be willing to deduct if the house or the apartment that he's renting remains vacant. In other words, there is a price there. How much would a person be willing to lease out the apartment for less money, knowing that the apartment is vacant? It's a funny way of thinking about it, but when you consider, let's say fair market value for a cottage or an apartment rental is $2,000 a month. But let's say someone would be willing to pay me $1,800 to keep the place vacant. Would I take it? And the answer might be yes, very much so. Why? Because I don't have to worry about a tenant. I don't have to worry about things breaking or wear and tear on the property. So therefore, according to the Nesivos, if this guy just opts to pick up and leave after the first week, I as a landlord would have to refund him a little bit of money, not a lot, but the amount that I would be willing to take to have this cottage be vacant for a week instead of be occupied for a week.
Probably also variable costs like electricity and water and stuff that's not being used. So I guess that's a savings as well.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. There's no utilities, right? But the Ksos HaChoshen disagrees, and he says that the tenant has to pay the full amount without getting any discount refunded to him because he made a commitment, and the landlord is due the entire amount. That's what he was relying on, and therefore he's due the entire amount. Of commitments to rent properties.
Could you repeat that, please, Rabbi?
The question that Brian is asking is during COVID, a lot of people had made plans, put down payments or maybe full payments on rental properties that they were planning to go to for vacation, and they had to back out at the last minute because of COVID.
Lockdown, right?
Yeah, because of lockdown or whatever concerns there were. What would the halacha say as far as the obligations of the landlord vis-a-vis the tenant? It's a very good question. So here you have a situation where there's an onus, it's an emergency situation. The guy ends up not being able to use the property, but he paid up front for it. Is the landlord obligated to refund the money or not? So first of all, you see that there's a machlokes, whether the landlord has an obligation to refund the money or not. And based on the fact that it's a machlokes in this situation, he can hold on to it because whenever there's a dispute on monetary issues, whoever currently is holding on to the money is allowed to continue holding on to it. You can't, the burden of proof is on the extractor. Amotze mechavero olav haraya is the way that the Gemara states it. Now, that the only argument that I think you could make to argue contrary to this is that in the case of the pandemic, it was not an individual onus. It was not this one person's emergency that precluded him from being able to take possession of the property. It was a worldwide onus that precluded anybody from being able to take the property, in which case that property now becomes unrentable. In other words, it's not like the landlord can claim because you backed out of the property, you made me lose money because I could have rented it to somebody else. That's no longer the case. Like I had a situation where I had put down a down payment on a band in Montreal for my son's wedding at the very beginning of COVID. Okay. And everything was shut down. There was no way, there were no weddings taking place, no bands, period. If there was a wedding, it would be in a backyard with just a couple of people. And there was no, so the guy had originally told me, I'm losing money, yada, yada, yada. I said, but there's no way, there are no other jobs. It's not like I made you lose a job. There was no other job you could have gotten during that time. So I said, listen, he said, but then he started playing the violin proverbially. And he said, I'm making a wedding. My son's getting married. I need to pay for his wedding. He needs money to start off with. I said, okay, if you want to keep the down payment, I'll just consider it to be tzedakah. And you can have it as tzedakah. I said, but because he was a Jewish guy. I said, but I don't think that you're entitled to it. I think really the halacha would say that you should return the down payment because there's no way that the purpose of the down payment is to make a person whole because he blocked off that night and his commitment to me precluded him from making money from somebody else. That's the reason why a person's entitled to keep the down payment. But in this kind of situation, everything was shut down. Service providers were not able to gain income during that period of time, period. And so I don't think that it's comparable to situations that are discussed in normative halacha. Okay, that's a very good question, but I'm not sure whether I've seen it explicitly anywhere or not, but it certainly is a logical differentiation.
In this case, a band leader having to make a wedding, his wedding is going to cost a lot less too if he makes it quickly during COVID. So he's saving money as well. But that's just a side point. I wonder also about trip cancellation insurance. I know we've kind of been there before where we've talked about insurance and the impact. But if someone has trip cancellation insurance and they're going to be made whole for what they've lost from what they paid, does that have a bearing on the relationship between the renter and the owner?
It may very well have bearing, sure, because if the insurance company is paying the guy who's going on vacation for his lost money, so then why should the landlord have to pay? Why would I think the landlord has any obligation to pay him? Or maybe just pay him the difference between the insurance payment and what the cost of the rental is. But remember, the final psak is that once the landlord has collected the money, he's not under any obligation to return any of the money. It's only if there was an onus. Number one, it has to be an emergency out of the control of the tenant. Someone got sick. And number two, that he hasn't yet paid the full amount, where there's an argument to be made that he can say, I don't have to pay the remainder for the remainder. Yeah, usually there is a cancellation policy in place. Usually when it's Airbnb or anything else like that, there are very clear stipulations made up front. But not always are there very clear stipulations. In a situation where a friend has a cottage and he's doing you a favor and renting it to you for a couple of weeks, there may not be stipulation, then these halachas would kick in. Okay, so we'll hold it here. Let me wish you all a good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. Hopefully things will